Repatriation with your God divinity does not require a reconciliation. Rather, it requires only cooperation. Repatriation with your God divinity does not require reconciliation. Rather, only requires your cooperation. The Master Jesus in his ministry often used metaphors. One that we love to turn your attention back to is the metaphoric story of the prodigal son. A very wealthy man with two sons. Once the sons are of adult age, bestows upon his two sons a certain amount of his wealth. One son decides to leave home, go out into the world, see what's in the world, travel. And in the course of this, over a number of years, the son loses everything. His entire investment his father gave him, his entire inheritance. Slowly he makes his way back to his father's home, and yet is full of grief, full of embarrassment, full of all sorts of human emotion, full of shame. And even though he's made himself back to the village, must yet go through some deeper suffering before he has the strength to show up on his father's doorstep. The Master Jesus said the son was found eating food from troughs that pigs ate out of. And finally, the son succumbs to his situation and returns to the father's house. Upon returning, the father is filled with so much joy. So much joy. The son who stayed home watches his father greet the son who's returned home. The son who's returned home says, "Father, be not so full of joy. I have lost everything you gave me." The father already knew this just by looking at his son. The way he was dressed, the wear and tear on his life, it was already evident to the father. The father did not ask for reconciliation. The father did not ask, "Well, what did you do? What did you do that you lost everything?" And the father simply said, "Never mind. What's important now is that you are home." And much to the chagrin of the brother who stayed home and enjoyed the presence of his father and all the riches, the father bestows his kingdom upon the second son again. Oftentimes, when Jesus was out on the road and traveling in the caravans with the disciples and others, and this is where many of the stories are collected of the miracles that took place, the healings. And Jesus would often go amongst the multitudes that would gather, and sometimes there were 10, 15,000. And I know that today you have great auditoriums where 20,000 can gather, but it wasn't that way in Jesus' time. There was no automation, there was no trains or airplanes or buses or automobiles, so people walked long distance when they heard of this mystical man that had powers, and they traveled, and they brought with them family members who had lost limbs, family members who were diseased, blinded. And Jesus would teach, and it was generally after his teaching that he would then go out amongst the multitudes. And as he passed amongst them, and especially those, and he usually gave a signal for the multitudes to bring those forward who were ill. And the master generally only spent about, maybe 5 to 15 seconds with each one. And sometimes he touched them, and other times he looked right through to them, and he connected with their divinity and brought their divinity forward. And as the divinity was brought forward of the individual by the Master Jesus, because they had the power to do so, those individuals were made whole again. Now again, Jesus did not say to those who required healing, "What have you done with your life? How did you get in this situation?" He did not demand reconciliation. There's a willingness to receive, a willingness to come home. And all that Jesus said was, and it was always the same, and it was in context to his own Hebrew teaching, go and sin no more. Jesus could have said, and would have meant the same thing, go and live a constructive life. But the point was there was no request to reconcile. There was no request even to ask for forgiveness. Nothing was asked. Only come home. Come home. So I ask you to be with this statement because it approaches it all a little differently. And of course, we're using these words repatriation, reconciliation. They have context in ways that the world uses them. Yet within those words, there's enough context that I feel that we could associate that with your own ability to connect with your divinity with no regrets. And most importantly, to connect with your divinity without the one thing that will stand as an obstacle. And that is guilt. Be ye as an empty cup. You do not need to bring your guilt to me. Because you see, the Father through the Christ, the Father's presence through a prophet who is individualized, does not ask for reconciliation, because the Father's presence through an individual that has become the Christ sees the wholeness of your being. And even though it may be set aside, even though that wholeness may have become so withdrawn that there's something else that's acting in the individual, makes no difference. The Christ sees right through and right past what seems to be the situation of the person's life. And the Christ zooms right in and connects with the divinity of the individual. The Christ is doing this on behalf, for the individual, because the individual cannot do this for themselves. And in the future, as untouchables, you too will do this for others. And so we must make sure that we are erasing from ourselves any idea of reconciliation. To be repatriated with your divinity only requires you come back to it. You don't have to make good. You don't have to validate all the things that went wrong, all the mistakes that you made. But you do have to find that way of presenting yourself to your divinity without guilt or shame. And this is that story that you have to tell yourself. And it can be as simple as, why would I hold myself back from repatriation? Why would I hold myself back from love, mercy, and forgiveness? Because the truth is, the human race is so complicated. The human race has compromised itself as a race of individual consciousness. And because it has compromised itself, without intervention, without revelation, everyone makes mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. I've made mistakes. You've made mistakes. And therefore, we are grateful to have the opportunity to forgive ourselves. And all true teaching, you are not asked to ask for forgiveness. You are asked to forgive yourself. Yes, I made a mistake. I realize I have been living less than. And yet, you've got to find a way of coming to terms with that so that that mistake doesn't carry deep emotions of shame or guilt. Because as long as they are there, they become self-imposed obstacles. Self-imposed obstacles. Really, no, precious hearts. Really. There may be, some oddballs here and there in your life. Or maybe while you were growing up, maybe a careless parent or a careless caregiver said to you, you should be ashamed of yourself. And there are careless statements that are said to people, especially when they're younger, that can build that energetic vibration of guilt and shame. Yet I ask you, in your elevated state of consciousness, in the enlightenment that you have achieved thus far, the place that you are in, your consciousness already undergoing wonderful transformation, would you really find yourself saying to someone, you should be ashamed of yourself? You just wouldn't approach it that way anymore. You'd find different ways of approaching it. Okay, something has happened here. Now let's work together and try and correct it. Because in some of the tenets of your awakening, there are some principles that you agreed to live by. That of the 5 things that so anchor and continue to reinforce human consciousness, we taught you as soon as this dispensation began. There must be a willingness on your part to suspend condemnation, to suspend criticism, to suspend judgment. And if you do this, and for the most part you have, how can you then turn and say to someone, you should be ashamed of yourself? You are guilty. By now, I do hope you realize that if the law of your lands create a situation where you receive a notice in the mail that you are called to court, that your name has been chosen to serve on a jury. Do you understand where I'm going with this? Now, there's two ways you could approach this. You could say to yourself, all right, I'll do this. I'll do this in context of human law. And I will do this without any personal attachment. I will just observe and go with the human law as these things are approached. Or you will simply say, and I will say to you, that's going to be a bit of a challenge for you. Or you can say, and you can report back to whoever summoned you to jury duty that I cannot attend jury duty because it is in conflict with my deepest spiritual beliefs. Now, because the government doesn't know what to do with spirituality, you might have to use the term religious beliefs so that they understand. A peacemaker. Mm-hmm. So, you know, precious hearts, always through your process is to remember those tenets, to remember those basic, those fundamentals that we incorporated in the early years of this teaching, to no longer engage in the 5 human habits: criticism, condemnation, judgment, blame, and gossip. There's that blame. That's that 4th one. So, even with that one, just standing out on that one, blame, how can you then say a statement, you should be ashamed of yourself? So, we knew, the Ascended Master teachings knew, there is so much involved in these 5 human activities that just a simple contemplation can make you realize this covers so much material. This is so vast. And if I really practice it, and I hope you understand by now, with any teaching that you are asked to elevate your behavior to, your own higher discerning intelligence will discern events that can happen in your life and say, there is a life lesson coming up here. There's a situation coming up. I see. Remember, precious hearts, it's going to be more important because the time has come. It's not quite now, but it's coming. It is coming. And you might decide to practice it or not. Mother Akasha hasn't put down the gauntlet, but the time will come that you're going to be asked to declare that your senses do not belong to you anymore, and that you do not give your human aspect any permission to use your senses, even the sense appetite. And you know what I mean by that. That all your senses must be owned and governed by your higher mental body. Now I say, that time is not yet. That time is around the 28th passage of resurrection. And this gives the higher mental body absolute authority. And this is where the higher mental body begins to bring in Saint Germain's flame or rays of transfiguration. Because the food appetite, the sex appetite, all belonging to the senses, can be transfigured by the higher mental body, which raises the energy functioning through those senses to the highest vibration. And this becomes an enormous bridge in which the incoming and soon to be outgoing Christ is assisted in taking complete dominion over the faculties and senses of the outer self. So just know that that's coming down the road. So another thing that I would now like to bring in is, at a recent class, I suggested, as an example, if you have an area of your life that is not working out, if you have an area of your life in which there seems to be some absence, some limitation, and I use the example of abundance, and you're entering into all sorts of abundance decrees, and nothing's happening. I said, and I want to say right now, what I said was intended to be a temporary suggestion, not a permanent suggestion. I suggested, if you're in a situation where there is a lack of abundance, and soon there may be some demands on your life, and for you feel that your decrees are not working because you've been decreeing for abundance for several years and the situation is getting worse. I said, you are better off to set aside your calls. Now, I have to be a little bit more careful because sometimes students will take something I say and give it a slightly different context. So then I have to come back and say, yes, I said, a student in that situation should set aside their calls. I didn't say tear them up. I said set them aside for a while. Because if you are calling and calling and calling forth, you are decreeing, and nothing is happening, you are going to build a big conflict within yourself, and inside that conflict is a psychological factor that is building and building. And if I go inside and read that psychological factor, then I see that that is saying God is a withholding God. So you're actually working against yourself. Yes? So then I say, okay, now you can add what Mother said last night about being blocked, right? If you're a student that has challenges here, you've got a blockage. Yes? So you can use too Mother Akasha's technique and realize that although there are lesser factors, the one prominent factor that takes up 90% of what can block you is unforgiveness. And Mother Akasha invited you to take an afternoon, take an evening, and say, okay, clearly I'm blocked here. Things are not flowing from the inner activity. And so Mother Akasha suggests that this is unforgiven. This is energy acting as a blockage because there is someone I have not forgiven. So then she invited you to call to your higher intelligence, your guardian angels, your spirit guides, me. Sure, put me to work some more. I don't mind. No, I really don't. To flash you the images of people that you may think you've forgiven, but maybe your forgiveness is not complete. Or there are people that, your human stubbornness is right full on. Good for you. Because guess what? When I had to come into your world and we had to take on some qualities too, the last thing I let go of was my stubbornness. I'm still stubborn, but I use it in the most constructive way. Mm-hmm. I tell myself. So, sometimes that stubbornness can show up and say, yeah, I hear it all, but what this person did is unforgivable. And I know I'm supposed to forgive, but I'm not there yet. So no matter what you say, help keeps coming in. Helps keep coming in. Who is the one test? Who is the one ascended master that you can count on? Who is the one, and don't jump on me on this, let me say it first, then you can all respond. Who is the one ascended master where you privately can say to yourself, I know I'm supposed to forgive. I know it's the right thing to do. But also in my heart of hearts, I don't feel I am there. If I am to do this, I am going to need help. I'm going to need someone who is greater than me in their evolution, who can come in and on my behalf forgive this person. Who is that ascended master? Mother Mary. So what do you do with that, precious hearts? You see, with these teachings, one thing about any stubborn human nature, you're going to box yourself in the corner, because we'll come back to you and say, well, what about this? And what about this? How can you say, I'm not completely ready to forgive when Mother Mary's offered to do it for you? Well, I'll tell you why. Because you're piffed off at the person. Because it's not because you don't have the ability to forgive. It's because you won't forgive. And so you just have to you have to keep bringing it on and bring it right in front of you. Does any energy acting in me of unforgiveness, is that energy benefiting me? Is it a lightness upon my being? Or is it a pressure that's just going to hold me back? To look at it in all ways that you can. All right?